Hello and welcome to Humans of Reliability. I'm Ashley from Rootly, and today I'm joined by Tristan Watson, who has a very broad range of platform engineering experience, mainly specializing in serverless technology, and he's currently working as an SRE at Oak National Academy in London, but recently spent about 4 years in the reliability engineering org at Rafa, the cycling company. So, Tristan, I'll toss it over to you to say hello. And if there's anything you'd like to add to your introduction, please feel free.
Yeah, hi everyone. As said, Tristan Watson. So yeah, I've been working nearly 10 years now in a wide range of topics all across observability and monitoring. First company was public cloud, which definitely needs monitoring, a sort of startup trying to do that, all the way through to sort of working with Rafa and now with a contract at the Oak National Academy, trying to level up their monitoring and observability and sort of parachuting into a different org of a different size and trying to bring that forward to have an exemplar that we can use to push forward that across the organization for developers and product owners.
Perfect. And we can kind of just jump right into the questions because I have a whole bunch of them for you. One thing that I've seen you talk about a fair bit in this space is monitoring and observability setups and kind of the culture that comes with it. So I wanted to start with just a broad question about what, in your opinion, are like the hallmarks of a strong observability culture?
Sure, I think passive learning is a massive element of that. So with the rise of instant messaging tools across even now, like across the last 10 years, we've seen, and I'm talking there just for clarity about things like Slack. We're still continuing to see people that perhaps aren't familiar with tools like that across the industry get into instant messaging and start using it in a way that maybe they haven't. The example of that I give there perhaps is I've joined sort of 3 or 4 businesses where you come in and the Slack is not paid for, and then all over like a year, someone's like, "Hey, it's a good idea to pay from that," and you have everyone on board into it. So, how do you get passive learning and day-to-day learning of observability and monitoring into a a chat program like Slack? Is sort of one of the main questions that I ask as well. So, monitoring the observability has to be approachable for everybody, and it has to be, in my view, termed and digestible for the majority of users. So by that, I'm looking really for anyone in the organization to be able to get an alert and understand what's going on with it. So that's kind of the communication side and the notification side of things. And how does a user, in my view, have the main sort of way in to see what that looks like? And then you can start adding, the contextualized aspects of it. I mainly am working at the moment in the sort of the serverless and a more modern stack with smaller businesses. So what that means is you have a lot of different platforms stitched together. So it's kind of a composable architectures that I'm working with. So that might be something like Vercel and Next.js in the front end, and then some sort of middleware that is serverless in the back end. And that's quite hard to monitor as well. So to try and get that leveled up, I kind of feel like you need the ability to put everything into a single pane of glass solution. So you've got all the hallmarks of a normal kind of monitoring system. And by that, I mean you have metrics, the kind of metrics, you've got alerts, you've got events, which I think are more important nowadays than ever before. Um, but it also means that your infrastructure is kind of running in a different place. So you may not have in this serverless world and serverless architecture that many services to monitor, but you will in terms of like services yourself that you're running on your own. You may not even have any servers to run, right? Serverless. So you may not actually have a Kubernetes cluster or anything like that. But you do need to still monitor it in a way. And actually, you've probably got more single points of failure than you think, because if a service goes down, you need to notice them and not you. And that means that you need a monitoring system that's able to be stitched together in a way where if anything goes down, you're aware. And perhaps, therefore, the process of recovering from that becomes more and more important. And like response becomes more and more important because you need to have a way to know when to panic and know when your hands are tied as well. So that's kind of an emerging space right now. So we're using all of at Oak, we're sort of like looking at how we can do that and push that forward, but also looking across the board more generally about how can systems that are observable and composable as a way forward be put together in a way where they have a clear blast radius, and you can improve across the board all of your monitoring. So, for example, if a cell goes down, it's going to be fairly difficult to do something. So same with sort of Cloudflare. Depends where you are, but that with serverless becomes a bit more of a problem because you don't run or own any of those systems properly yourself.
Yeah, I think serverless is something I'd like to dive more into because I honestly am not very well versed in the ins and outs of what serverless looks like, and I did a little bit of research to just refresh myself on the whole thing. And um, I imagine that because you're kind of outsourcing all of these different infrastructure tasks to your cloud provider, like there's a lot of abstraction happening. There's a lot of things you're not manually operating, but you still need some understanding of the state of things. Like, how do you approach that observability or those unique considerations that come with serverless? And you had also kind of mentioned the importance of events. I'd love to hear how that ties into things as well. When you're looking at having just, yeah, a solid, like, monitoring and observability setup with a serverless architecture.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we talk about serverless, like some common things that will be looked at with sort of a, say, AWS, you would be using something like Lambda, you'd be using SQS for queuing. So you put something into a queue. And then you could use like a state machine or something to really sort of manipulate that data. And you kind of can use it to transform things. It's a really powerful way, especially for businesses that aren't huge. Like we're talking startups or businesses that have a smaller arm, like a retail business, a great example. Um, it gives them a way to sort of pay per use ultimately. And that's kind of like
Mhm.
where serverless has stood on its own 2 feet, where you don't have to run these servers if you're not doing anything. And also a retail business, as an example, is constantly fluxing. So Christmas might be really busy, or it might not, depending on what you're selling. And therefore serverless comes into its own, but it's also notoriously hard to monitor because you have one event, especially if you're building an event-driven sort of architecture, where you have something that comes in, an event, and it can have multiple subscribers and it can do something, and the data will filter through to the system that it needs to, and then the user will get the result. So that could be placing an order, that could be updating an email address for a user, for a customer. So it's really hard to monitor that. And I think the main thing there that is going to be useful is the use of tracing. So we're talking, open telemetry, using traces through there, and instrumenting your code as easily and as well as possible to ensure that you have the event lifecycle of request for an event-driven request all the way through. So you might get to the database and back, and how long does that take? Where's the bottleneck? And that's again sort of like to that point that I made before about passive learning, where developers then can see that and they can understand the whole request, the whole life cycle, where it took a few more milliseconds. Is the request actually coming back? Is it 400ing or at an area that you didn't expect? And having that that full route span, so having the full life cycle visualized in a tool that you can pass to the users and add to things like incident response is a really like cheat code for serverless monitoring, and it's very
Yeah.
very hard to do that without. And then just to talk about events as well, like events is an interesting one because they are distinct from metrics and they're usually like customer events. So you can also start there, and maybe it's a good place to start if you're trying to level up your observability and monitoring, where you can have an easy way to get an event such as a password reset happening, and then you can start benchmarking that, right? So you can say, this is how many we have, and this is the average that we get per hour. Yes, it might not be the best, but it becomes like with serverless, you can definitely create those business events like username, password resets, or things like that. And that tells you, are things running well? Are things actually happening as you'd expect? And if you just sort of you're on that journey, maybe that's a better place to start, because you probably find that the way that businesses like that are monitoring, that are leveling up what they're monitoring, is that someone comes to them and say, "Hey, this isn't working." So it's kind of beating them to the line of, "Hey, something's not working," by getting an alert that says something's not working.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting. Have you found that, I know you've been in SRE roles, like the actual process of diagnosing and mitigating incidents looks quite different in a serverless architecture because of that? Or is it pretty similar? Just, can you talk about maybe that process, like the actual remediation of an incident when you're working serverless?
Yeah, sure. I do feel like it's a bit more challenging for everybody across the board because there's so many systems that touch. When you're working on a sort of microservice, it's usually the bounds are quite clear. But when you're passing events across and then those things are working together, maybe it gets lost a little bit in the translation between different areas and different applications and how the organization set up. So normally that is fairly similar. You will have an event failure, a metric failure, and you've got to put those in place. So you might have a cloud function that's erroring or a KPI that started to, the error rate's going down massively, and you're not able to determine why. But I think the use of traces is what I've found really, really useful over the last few months internally as well. Like being able to really look at and start looking to implement that properly, it just seems a bit of a, an unknown cheat code. And yeah, it can be expensive. But you can ultimately, set the tracing sample rate that you can at least know if something's going wrong. And it feels to me as well, though, that there's a bit of a double-edged sword there. Whereas if you've not got the traffic, you probably don't need it. So
Yeah.
the sample rate, yeah, okay, it's 5%, but how much traffic you actually getting? You might not be getting traffic for a few hours. So at that point, you need to go back to the standard logging and metrics of observability pillars instead. But for the most part, it looks quite similar. I think there's probably a bit more uncertainty in those systems, and a lack of clarity is just bred, because if you compare it, especially to something like a monolith system that's been built like a legacy monolith server, it's kind of interesting, but you know things are going wrong because someone shouted, or you have alerts that kind of walk through um, a process, and it's that there's less areas that it's going to fail in because you're not going across multiple services. You're just kind of following one big stack and expecting something to happen. And therefore, it's probably a lot more work to set up the observability for an event-driven system at times. But that sort of is also depends on the other element there is cost. So yeah, you could buy this server and run it all the time, but that might be more expensive than just running per request on a serverless sort of environment. So I don't know if it's particularly more difficult. I think there's maybe an expectation there that developers need to know how those systems work. And again, that's to me where tracing comes in, because developers are able to see that life cycle, and that's passive learning again. And then I'm quite big on that, really, like the cultural aspect of passive learning. How do you get things into Slack? How do you get things in a readable way and try and determine them so they can get that really coherent and also like top level view of the life cycle, because a lot of the time they might have worked on only a tiny bit of that because of the nature of the way that serverless applications can be set up, and they might not appreciate that it then goes to a database and pull something out because they've only worked on a bit of middleware somewhere else. So yeah, again, traces are kind of a cheat code for that.
Yeah, I love that you talk about like pulling it into Slack and having more people understand how the system is working and the system health, because that's like a soapbox I'm always on when it comes to incident response, is looking at it more holistically. And we're not just looking at the technical problem, but of all the moving pieces of who needs to be informed and the downstream impact of it. I'm wondering, like, when it comes to bringing that into Slack, are you typically building automation around that? Are there certain tools that you like to use to facilitate that? Or how have you approached actually getting that information and deciding what should be in Slack and then actually piping it there?
I think it's kind of down to the architecture almost of Slack as well. It's a really interesting one. There's always at least to me, that there's something really interesting about the development of Slack and the progression of Slack. People just seem to like buy the tool and then that's it, right? Whatever happens, it's kind of like a free for all of how channels are set up and all the rest of it. But I think it's something that has to be managed. It's kind of a garden where you need a gardener to go around and ask those questions. Um, One of the best places to start for that as well, like around passive learning, and one of the things that I find really interesting is just going into Slack and look at the analytics. So by that I mean, where are the messages sent? It'll be really interesting to see where private channels are used, or public channels are used. And that's maybe the best place to start for that workflow if you really want to bring it into Slack, because you need to ensure that people are in the channels where you're going to be posting the notifications, unless you really want to get those for a private message, which you probably don't. But you also need to make sure they're not muted. Like there's not too much fatigue on the team. So starting with the fewest say alerts and so on into an area is kind of how I would do it as well. So it's kind of prune the Slack garden first, maybe, have a look at that. Where are your teams? Are they set up in the right way? Have they got a private channel? Can people just jump in there and see that something's wrong? Then also probably introduce drip feed the alerts in as well, and the notifications. Like, if you have the abilities to do that, and you're just kind of starting out on your maturity journey. So it's drip feeding in the alerts perhaps, and making sure that only Sev1, Sev0s go into Slack to start with, where Sev0 is the highest severity. And from there you can kind of ensure, at least my experience, that people get on the alerting bandwagon and they can really see the benefit. But if you just swamp them with process, or you swamp them with alerts, it's never going to end well. Obviously, there's a lot of tooling, Rootly being one that's sort of come around to really mature that journey, making sure that things go really well. But I think just having a process, like the power of even setting up like a Slack channel for you, even if you don't go into something like
Yeah.
Rootly and use everything on day to day, that is so useful because you can get a title, you get a timestamp, and it just makes it easy. Because otherwise, you're kind of expecting like, what is the format for this again? How do I do this? Like if you haven't got a tool like that, so you don't have to use all the features to start with something like Rootly, like and I think that's also great because it just puts a wireframe in place for you to use. But yeah, I think back to the original point, I see a lot of people using Slack and a lot of businesses using Slack, and it's great and it works, but it's not great for someone that joins the business. And I think that's the way that people should look at it. If I join the business as a developer today, how would I find out and passively learn from this communications tool rather than
Yeah.
it just being a wild place where everything can go?
But I've really loved seeing this kind of evolution where I feel like earlier on, and we definitely went through this in orgs I've been in, where we all love Slack. And it's especially with like the rise of remote work, like Slack becomes, it is the company. Like everybody's doing their work in Slack. And there's been this perception or like doing certain tasks like incident management in Slack is this like bad habit. It's this thing because, you know, it's not integrated with our other tools, and there's issues with retention and scrolling back and, like, data
Mm.
preservation, and all of those things are so solvable through technology and, like, automation that we've gotten to this place where now, yes, there's Rootly. Obviously, we build a lot of functionality within the Slack integration to make that a part of the incident management process and solve for those problems while still allowing people to work in Slack because that is where we want to work. And I've been a part of teams like trying to train people out of using Slack for specific things. And I think if you find a tool that works so well that people actually want to use it, you should run with that because that is actually not very common. A lot of the time, getting people to adopt any sort of tooling is a nightmare. And Slack has the opposite problem where people love it so much, it's actually really hard to pull them out of it. So, like, how do we actually capitalize on that? And I think Slack even like, I tell people all the time, even if you're not at a stage where you're using Rootly yet or you don't have the budget or whatever, Slack itself has a lot you can do to automate just built in natively or through, like, broader tools like Zapier and stuff. I don't think it's gonna get you there for the incident
Mm.
management as a whole, long term, but if there's little things you need, I really encourage people to do that too. I think it's so smart and just lets people work where they wanna work. But something I wanna go back to because you briefly mentioned open telemetry. I don't think we can have a conversation about observability without talking about open telemetry right now. So I'd love to know just, like, your thoughts on OTel in general, and what you think it kind of says about where observability and monitoring is going as a whole.
It's the one thing that I've always really struggled with, really, where there has been no standard, There's always like something coming along, whether you have some like a big provider that has their own SDK and API, and you're trying to integrate it with that. But at the back of your mind, when you're thinking about this sort of thing, it's always been why, what happens if this goes away? What happens if this company gets, acquired by someone else? What happens if it merges into something else and they've got a library as well? And I think just having a great team that's backed by CNCF, and has already kind of absorbed open tracing, open census, and having it really lightweight and with all the SDKs and support it has across numerous languages, it feels to me like we're getting to a place finally where things get normalized. You don't have to like there's certain providers that will have their own sort of like exporter or way to get metrics into an API and all the rest of it. But it might be in a different format. It might not be, it's not in OTLP or the telemetry protocol, bit of a mouthful. Um, but it's kind of getting there to that place now where there is a standard for it, and you just do that and you can have semantic alerts like an HTTP status code could just be called an HTTP status code. Whereas, depending on the platform, it might be mapped to something different as a metric. So things don't become as portable when you have all of these providers. And that's what OTel really gives you. It gives you that portability where if something goes away, and you see tools as well, there's certain tools that have really come along recently in the metric tracing and logging space that are great, they're really, really good, but it's slow to change these things. It's really, really slow to change these things. And it's really, really slow to actually do an MVP and test them, and potentially expensive. So having something like an hotel collector that you know is open source, you can go and raise a bug, you can ensure that for the most part the community is dictating the direction of it. Um, is really great compared to like a large company where you might need support and you might need, to how much, all the rest of it with general enterprise customers where you might need support, you might need to understand how something was designed. Maybe it was designed without that in mind to start with, and now they've sort of like put it in. But you could potentially try a new exporter on your open telemetry collector somewhere. You don't even need an open telemetry connector, but like the idea that you can just append something to it to try out a service because you know that the telemetry data is there and just start shipping it across, and then you try another platform to see if you like it. I really feel that that's the right approach. And I really feel like that's a space that's coming on. So yeah, as a developer, like the whole developer user story is great because if you can standardize it that much and just get someone to plug in the right instruments, and there'll be more and more instruments as well. And you can just get them to sort of plug in the metrics. And when they're developing, it kind of becomes like a test, right? Oh, have I actually exported these metrics? How do I get them? Can I visualize them? Can I ship them across? Can I just, print them out and see? That becomes really great because I think it sometimes can be a bit of a struggle to get those things done. Similar to QA, like as a developer, right? When you're sort of leading teams and thinking about that, it can be quite hard to get that into the definition of ready and definition of done. Where testing it's kind of potentially an afterthought for shipping. And I hope that metrics and logging and traces are thought of in the same way, where it's there from day one, and you kind of like put it into your definition of done and make sure everything's kind of working properly and reporting properly. So yeah, I've got real hopes for the project, and I'm glad to see that it's continuing. Like it always felt kind of potentially a bit immature, and over the last sort of 18 months, I've really seen it grow and become like a standard. And I think a lot of people are excited about it, and there's a lot of potential there for using the library more. But just the standardization of the way that we do things as developers and the way that we manage those things as an SRE, that's so cool. So yeah, hopefully keep seeing that progress.
Yeah, definitely. I've been to, I think, 2 or 3 KubeCon events over the past year or so, and obviously it's a CNCF event, so people are naturally gonna be interested, but OTel is really one of the things that I see the most hype about consistently at KubeCon, that people are really like, everyone has questions about it, everyone wants to talk about it. I know, like, Adriana Vilea, who's, she's like an OTel advocate and does a lot of work in that space. She's just, like, swarmed at every KubeCon giving talks, and people are really excited about it. So definitely have to touch on it here. But I know we're coming up on time, and I will be in big trouble from our CEO, JJ, who you know well, if someone asks you one question about cycling. So from what I hear, you are a pretty avid cyclist, and I'd love to hear just a bit about your setup. Like, what is your essential cycling gear? What are you riding right now?
I've got a few bikes, which I think anyone that's into cycling is like, yeah, of course. And anyone that's not is like, what? What are you talking about? So I think I did. My friends were here this weekend and they said, how many bikes have you got? And I think it was like total across like my parents' house and things like that. And frames, I think it was like 7 or 8 bikes. So things have gotten a bit out of hand over the last few years. I think though also like I'm getting towards more of a like I love riding my bike, right? And I think people should ride their bike more, and we should be designing cities in particular, like around that. But I'm getting back to the place where what does it mean for me, and what does cycling look like? So like for the people that really like it out there, like I'm talking, I've got a titanium bike, I've got a mountain bike, I've got a cyclocross bike. Um, but probably my favorite bike, if like I take everything into it, is just my like pub bike. So like the bike
Yeah.
that I ride to the pub on, like single speed, super simple, throw some panniers on the back, get there. It's snowing, no problem. It's raining, no problem. And that's what I want people to get more out of cycling more and more as probably getting a little bit older. I just want people to get out there and doing it. I actually thought about doing some like project that I'm looking into at the moment, which kind of will use open telemetry and like some there's a new sensor that's come out that I saw on Hacker News recently that can look at particulate matter.
Mhm.
I don't know if it's good enough for outside. There's probably too much noise there in terms of CO2. But I really love the idea of like having a pub bike that has a sensor on it that I can kind of just like have it as a air quality monitor and just ride it around and like try and smooth that out and use open telemetry. So like when I get back home, I can either plug it in or maybe even it connects via like Wi-Fi and just uploads the metric somewhere and then visualize like where I've been and what the particular matter is. But I'd never do that on my like fancy road bike, right? So I was like on my Cannondale Super 6 Evo or whatever, I would never like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna because everything's about weight. So yeah, I think more and more I'm getting back to like the yeah, just get out there and ride and have fun. Riding bikes. So I think in cities as well. I don't yeah, in London it's getting better and better and I hope that continues. And ultimately, like, I hope one day a game gets to the point where it's like, my mother is I can be like, oh yeah, just ride your bike there. And it's like, yeah, rather than just ride your bike there and everyone looks at you like you're a bit crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I would not call myself a cyclist, but I do agree that, like, at the end of a night at a pub or whatever, getting on a city bike, that ride home is heaven. It's there's nothing great than just cruising home on a city bike and all the fresh air, that beats the backseat of an Uber any day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're getting there as well. But I think here in London it's good, but there's something to be said as well. And we're in Europe, obviously, but yeah, just over the channel, you got Copenhagen, you got Amsterdam. Both of them are like an amazing place to ride a bike. And everyone, oh, we can't do it here, but yeah, it's pretty flat in London. So yeah, long may that continue.
I'm gonna be in Amsterdam in November, and I'm definitely getting on a bike while I'm there.
Got to do it. Yeah. If you haven't been shouted at by a Dutch person for riding like an idiot in Amsterdam, I don't think you've lived. It's like a great
Yeah, I
experience.
went bike in Berlin when I was there, and then I saw it, and I was like, "Maybe not. Maybe that's not for me."
Yeah, it's good fun. But yeah, so I think that's kind of I think there's a lot of I think that's another thing as well with open telemetry that's quite interesting at the moment where, if it becomes a standard, you could use it for so many things. And I think like with the reduction in cost, like another thing that I was looking at with open telemetry, these are just like weird hacky side projects that they spent far too much time thinking about. But it was like, yeah, can I I've got a camera here. It's London, so we have a lot of foxes in London, like loads of foxes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
was there
foxes.
I didn't see a single fox, dang.
Oh, we have a fox that lives in the garden, I think. But what I'd like to do is like put a camera on the back and then use like some computer vision and like, add it to open telemetry again. So yeah, thinking about ways to maybe use open telemetry in more integrated systems. And yeah, I'd also like to like count vehicles. I think like the way that we do traffic counting is unnecessarily expensive, perhaps. So, but yeah, so many uses for open telemetry. I think it could be really, really useful, but I don't want to do it if it's not standard. So I don't want to write this big thing and then use it with like a provider that's got its own expensive way to send metrics when I could just like use one thing and then aggregate it in any platform that I want. So yeah, it's a cool project of it.
Yeah, that's fun. You gotta start a blog of little open telemetry side projects or something.
Yeah, I think I should. I think I should. I've got to do them all first though, but everything's quite
Yeah.
expensive.
Yeah, fair. Awesome. Well, Tristan, I don't wanna keep you because I know we're running over time, and it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on to Humans of Reliability. Is there anything before we close off that you would like to leave the audience with? You're more than welcome to if you have a project, or a passion project in your head that you wanna plug, like open telemetry for foxes, anything at all you'd like to leave folks with, please feel free.
Yeah, if you want to reach out, I'm Triwatts in most places. So that's TRIWATS underscore on X these days. So that's Triwatts underscore.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time on Humans of Reliability.